Hello, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David. Since the pandemic hit and made touring and performing impossible, I've taken to broadcasting interviews with people on the internet 2 or 3 times a week, usually at 10 a.m. Pacific time on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon. But today it's a special 4 p.m. edition. All these interviews also then go out in podcast form afterwards, which you can find if you look up This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform, or just go to davidrovix.com or get the David Rovix mobile app. I also do a live concert on the last Saturday of each month, along with various other random broadcasts. This month's concert will actually be a recording session that I'll be live streaming from Big Red Studio in Corbett, Oregon. Today, we're spending the hour with someone who is, for a change, right here in the same city I'm in Portland, Oregon, the New York-based journalist, author, and chef Arun Gupta. Arun is the founder of various legendary independent media platforms and writes regularly for The Intercept, Jacobin, The Nation, and many other publications, both in print and online. He's been actively covering the protests that have been going on here in Portland for the past several months and has a long-standing relationship with the city. And great to have you on my little show here, Arun. And
great to be with
every time, as I mentioned to you before, every time Portland becomes a national headline, which is happening, it's sort of somewhat unpredictably, but sporadically, like about once a week or so. And then I'm constantly hearing from people, actually from around the world, who are saying, like, what the heck is going on there, who just have a hard enough time trying to figure out what's happening in the U.S. generally. And then when they hear about Portland, they're just really confused. And I'm not even sure what the most sensible place is to start to try to intro Portland and what's going on here to people. But like, if we kind of assume people are paying some attention, but not like really close attention, where would you even start?
White supremacy.
White supremacy, the founding of the state.
Yeah, I mean, at one level it's jargon, at another level it can be very descriptive if we unpack what we're talking about here. Portland's previous claim to fame, of course, was with Portlandia, and I think that is kind of a good way to enter it, right? Because it's all about how it's this very, weird and quirky city. But one thing that never gets talked about is how it's an extremely white city. And, what they're very much celebrating in that show is a certain type of white culture. Basically, once you get west of the Mississippi, nearly every state outside the Southwest is founded as this kind of like white utopia. Mike Davis, he writes about this in City of Quartz, especially with the founding of California and Los Angeles, that areas out west were marketed to Midwesterners as kind of like clean and pure and fresh and free from, all the Untermensch. And so this has a lot to do with the founding and initial construction, right? Identities are construction. The nation state ultimately is an idea. So Oregon is founded as this explicit white supremacist, if not white nationalist republic. Black people were initially outlawed from the state by the state constitution. They weren't even supposed to be allowed to pass through the state. And then the law for decades was they weren't even supposed to be able to allowed to reside in the state. And I think that was on the books until like 1923. And that if any African-American person was found residing within the state, they were to be flogged in public every 6 months. And this also goes hand in hand with the settler colonialism, right? Black people are not allowed here versus indigenous people. We're going to wipe them out. And this just ends up shaping, it's this kind of Oregon's Big Bang, that you're seeding the cultural universe, and all that flows from there is is heavily influenced and shaped by that early history. And so you get to World War II, and there's still a tiny African American population, but with the Pacific War effort, West Coast cities are flooded with, who is it? They're now a healthcare company, the shipyard, Kaiser, right? Kaiser Permanente. They were a shipbuilding company originally. So, and they were doing massive shipbuilding for the Pacific War effort. They're bringing up poor whites and poor blacks from the South. So Portland becomes one of these seven coastal cities with a very large large increase in the African American population. But there was just a tremendous amount of racism, and there were African Americans who said that the racism in Portland was worse than the racism in South Carolina. So that's saying something. And after World War II, Portland had the biggest outflow of African Americans of any of these port cities during the war effort. And then
biggest outflow, and that was not just because of the destruction of Vanport and the flood in 1948.
I was just going to mention that's before the destruction of
wow.
Vanport, so
because people just felt so unwelcome in Portland.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you also have stuff like in Richmond, California, where the city eventually agrees to build subsidized housing because basically the city was running 24/7. The shipyards were going, there were 3 shifts, the bars, the clubs, the grocery stores, everything was going. And there was such a crushing demand for housing that the city finally agreed to build subsidized housing for African Americans, but on the condition that they be torn down when the war ended.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, the racism, and I don't want to there's a whole issue, we can potentially get into with the left. I wrote about this recently in a lengthy post on Facebook about how there's this kind of like liberal attitude, which I think you also find on the left as well, that racism is unchangeable. And so it feeds into this kind of like class denialist identity politics. We don't want to say that racism is completely fixed and unchangeable. It's a social phenomena. So of course it can be changed, and we can, we want to change the conditions and ideology of society so we can eventually eliminate racism. But in terms of back to Portland, so, from this history in you get this small African American population. You also have this whole history of Klan movements that then starts to, by the 70s and 80s, you get the rise of neo-Nazi Christian identity movements. They want to make the Pacific Northwest this kind of, again, a white utopia. And if we think about what America is, the idea of America, and you see this very much on the right and left, secular religion, America is utopian separatism, right? From the beginning, it's this idea that a group of people can basically create their ideal community. And so you have wonderful experiments and you have horrifying experiments. And so, when we get to the 70s and 80s, you still have a lot of this kind of racist violence. And in fact, there was an Ethiopian man who was murdered in not too far from the city center. I think, what's his name? Mulugata Sarah.
Right.
In fact, now what's considered a very Tony neighborhood, Laurelhurst, there's a fine steak restaurant, if that's your thing, right near the park where he was murdered. But the neo-Nazis also end up leading to the development of a strong anti-fascist movement. And, this is certainly coming, kind of the ripple effects of the counterculture. And I'm not an expert. I think there must be more to it, right? And I think this is where the Portlandia stuff comes in, that, Portland, it's a city where young people go to retire. Portland used to have a very low cost of social reproduction. In other words, you didn't need to make much money to afford housing.
Yeah.
You could bike around. It's like really you could, 20, 30 minutes was probably the furthest you ever needed to bike if to do errands. Rents even into the 2000s. I've been told by people they were like under $300 a month. There's a lot of people who grow their own food, a lot of bartering. And so it kind of created this, like, I think, quirky left counterculture. And that developed into this kind of like, starting in the 80s, this anti-fascist movement. And it also had, obviously it's liberal and progressive and elements as well, and also with small socialist elements in terms of organized socialists, at least. Portland also became infamous for its large demonstrations. I believe it was George Bush Sr. who gave Portland the nickname of Little Beirut because of raucous demonstrations here. And then during the Iraq War, when W came to town, there was a very large demonstration, I believe, for Portland, at least it was over 5,000 people. And again, very raucous. So it had this whole kind of tradition of left political activism, and the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists were essentially chased out of town, but they're still in the region. And so we fast forward to the Trump era, and so you have these kind of two divides. You have this white progressive left, and then there's also this very much this a reactionary white community. A lot of them are just kind of more standard middle class reactionaries, right? They're the homeowners. They're concerned about property value, and so they support policing of undesirables, right? Homeless, brown people, undocumented immigrants, and most of all, Black people. And then you get the more explicit racists with the, what I think a lot of scholars would say are explicit racist. But even then, it's kind of coded with Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys. Those are two of the more prominent groups. And in a lot of ways, the Trump campaign itself is just a big tent of racists, right? And I think it's pretty clear at this point that Trump is a fascist. You have this just really dumb mainstream media debate going on, like, oh, is Trump a fascist or not? And they keep coming to the conclusion, well, he's not, because we don't actually have fascism. And am I allowed to cuss, or is that like verboten?
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have a German accent, so how, this seems like that's some journalists they're like, oh, well, he can't be a fascist. He's not German, or I mean, it doesn't. I'm not quite clear what their definition is. Although I was going to ask you about the fascist thing in particular, because somebody I interviewed recently, a professor at the University of Massachusetts from Argentina, Graciela Monteagudo, she was saying that in her view, a lot of the fascist comparisons are overblown, and Trump is really more like a banana republic, kleptocratic sort, rather than like a well-oiled fascist fighting machine sort,
Oh, you see, that's what I'm getting at. It's a question of, is he a successful fascist? That's a different question. That's a completely different question, because no one out there would be saying like, well, Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. We don't live in a socialist country. That's like, no, he is an avowed socialist. Now, Trump isn't an avowed fascist, though he. When you're like anti-fascist, normally in terms of syntax, those two would cancel out and make you a fascist. But, he's an this blood and soil ethno-nationalist who glorifies violence for the supremacy of national glory, and to impose these severe reactionary norms around identity, particularly race, gender, sexual orientation, and citizenship. Right. I mean, citizenship isn't really an identity like the others, but it's all about who is the nation, and who belongs in the nation. And he has this very much, I mean, even that professor admits, well, he's like a dictator. Sure, he may be comical, he may be bumbling, he may be in many ways ineffectual, but everything that we see is consistent with a fascist ideology. And whether he's successful in implementing it, though, is a completely different question. And so, the fact that you have these type of like irregular uh, there's somewhere between like vigilante mobs and like state-sponsored extrajudicial militias, right? Because Trump is explicitly endorsing these mobs of violent armed men to go carry out violence, to impose this order. And we also see a lot of state complicity, if not like direct support for them. So what we've seen in what folks have seen in Portland in August was at least 3 different instances where these violent mobs of armed right-wing men come in, invade the city, right? Sometimes in buses, right? And so this is like, they are doing the exact thing that they're accusing
the outside agitators.
Right, the outside, and they even post photos. They're coming in on buses, and this has been this kind of like right wing trope since
about Antifa coming in on buses. But and yet, of course, after the killing of George Floyd and the rebellions that have gone on since then across the country, one of the most sort of, I guess, one of the things that makes it hardest for the right wing to talk about this is all a bunch of outside agitators is how the protests have happened in every city in the country at the same time. But in these cases, we're really talking about outside agitators coming in from all over.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it's also, it's like, it's illiberal, it's going after Marxism. I mean, like, everything about, the ideology, at least, it completely matches up with fascism. And then when we look at the effects, we've got concentration camps in this country. We have these refugee camps on the U.S. border. I visited them earlier this year. Never before in U.S. history have there been mass refugee camps on the border. I've talked to historians about this, and they're like, there's simply no parallel. At one point, it was estimated there were over 60,000 refugees who were camped out on the U.S. border who were trying to get in. This is before the pandemic, because already, Trump was making illegally shutting down the asylum process. That's another point to remember, that a lot of his acts in terms of immigration are completely illegal. And so the reason I mention those refugee camps is they're kind of like proto-death camps. It's safer for a lot of people to be there. They say that, because they were at grave risk of being killed, whether that's in, Honduras or southern Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, wherever. There's just the gang violence is become so extreme, and that whole history, of course, is intimately tied up with U.S. wars, U.S. the history of U.S. foreign policy in the region, as well as, we want these countries as basically transit points for their drugs. So they send us drugs and we send them guns. And that, we talk to people whose family members were just, butchered in just, like their bodies chopped up in front of children in horrifying way. And so they are literally fleeing for their lives.
And
But
they're safer, you say, on the border, or people say that they're safer on the border than if they stayed home in Guatemala or Honduras?
it is. But on the border, there's um, there's cartels that are. It gets complicated because the cartels also see them as a business opportunity. So in Matamoros, they're refugees who are able to afford housing, and so the cartels, the Gulf cartel, the Golfo cartel, is just like, hey, they're honest businessmen, so they're renting out apartments. There may be, especially to a lot of refugees coming from Cuba and Venezuela who have more means, or refugees who have relatives in the U.S. might be able to scrape together a couple of $100s a month. Then their services, right? They need to buy food, they need clothing, and on and on. But there's still people preying on them. They're still living in these, imagine living outdoors for more than a year. I'm in touch with people down there who've been now living camping for like 16 months. And when it rains, it's muddy, and you get the spread of potentially gastrointestinal diseases. When it's sunny and dry, then you get all this dust and the spread of respiratory diseases. And the medical workers, they're saying, pretty much everyone has this low level cough. Now there's COVID-19. They're also being preyed on by the state in terms of, there's allegations. A lot of people claim that the police or soldiers will come in, or even government workers, and rape women. It's not like it's happening all the time, but the point is, we can see that this is creating a foundation for death camps, right? Because as social destabilization increases, as climate chaos increases, more and more people are going to look to flee. And having this iron wall at the border, the logic, unfortunately, becomes very compelling that, hey, the U.S. will just outsource its death camps to Mexico. And the Mexican elite, of course, they don't give a shit. You give them enough money, and they'll be happy to do the dirty work of Americans. So this is, what we're talking about is Trumpism, fascism, and I really think, like, sure, let's have this debate, but it just to say, just because he hasn't succeeded in creating a fascist state does not mean he sure as hell isn't trying, or that him and his followers do not have this ideology at heart. And when you see them, right, I'm pretty active on Twitter. Folks can follow me there, and it's just like I constantly have these Trumpkins like coming after me, talking about civil war, talking about wiping out Antifa, talking about wiping out Black Lives Matter. They have this genocidal impulse, right? Because they also wipe out immigrants. And, Black Lives Matter is, just like, if you want to wipe out Black Lives Matter, you're just saying you want to wipe out Black people, And it's just like, and even if you don't want to do it now, it's like, this is where the logic leads. And so when we see these groups of Trumpkins who come into Portland, they're coming with weapons, they're coming with knives, and just like they have like dozens, if not hundreds, of cans of bear mace and paintball guns, which can leave quite a bruise, which can put an eye out.
Yeah.
And
they're bringing assault weapons as well, and pistols and all sorts of things. And then the question to me, and I don't know it's a slippery slope kind of thing, and I don't know if anybody knows, sort of, if there's no clear delineation, I guess, anywhere ever historically, anywhere between necessarily like when most people feel like it's relatively safe to have a protest, and when people start to realize increasingly that it's really not safe. I mean, not that it's ever been totally safe or unsafe. I mean, it's a range, and it depends on who's involved and the time and all kinds of other questions. But increasingly, it's like you're going to run into people carrying around weapons and pointing them at you. I mean, that's like the new reality that's just now normal.
Well, I think, we had this era of large mass protests that straddles the end of the Cold War to the beginning of Trumpism. So you go back, you had the massive Sane Freeze March in Central Park. That was I think like 500,000 to 1 million people in, I believe, 1982. It
Yep.
was to calling for disarmament of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And from there, you get, there's a lot of marches going on in terms of smaller marches going on in terms of around Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, but you also get bigger protests around women's rights, gay rights, and in the 90s, we also saw that as well. And then you get the whole anti-globalization era, global justice movement kicking off with Seattle. And then we go into the 2000s, and you just start to see one massive march after another, right? There's all the anti-war stuff around 9/11. There's the Day Without an Immigrant, which, when was that? Was that 2005, I believe?
And in 2006, there was some really big immigrant
2000.
led protests. Yeah.
And so that's, that those are actually the kind of the closest the U.S. has ever gotten to a general strike, where you saw these mass walkouts by, in cities like, 3, 4, 500,000 immigrants were just, they were shutting things down for a day. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City,
Dallas. Yeah.
Yeah, you get the environmental movement, and so you do like the People's Climate March in 2014, and so the thing is, like, you get these huge protests, and you don't have to worry about like armed right wing assault, and often you don't even have to worry about like that much state violence. But there's also a relation, right? Kind of the less of a threat you are, the less of an effect it seems to have. And so, we would see these huge anti-war marches. I mean, in 2003, it was like it was almost like every week there was like two, because I was going to a mall on the East Coast in New York, in DC, and Boston. Like, it was 2, 3, 4, 500,000. There must have been 7 or 8 of those in the first few months of 2003. But we didn't stop the war, and same with the People's Climate March. It just like it was completely defanged. So now, what we're seeing, I think, is we see this level of increased militancy, and it begins with Occupy Wall Street. And so it's a new type of protest. People were, I think, very dissatisfied with this kind of like you march around, you chant, you listen to speakers. Peter, Paul, and Mary play a tune, or Pete Seeger. When he was still alive. And it's very rote and boring. And the thing is, all protest is theater, and this type of like large protests had become bad theater. And Occupy Wall Street, which began in 2011, September 17, 2011, which comes in the wake of the Arab Spring, the movement of the squares in Europe, and also the Wisconsin uprising earlier this year. It was exciting theater, and it was a very different type of protest movement, and it very much influences what's going on now. Now we have this phenomena of continual protest, right? That this idea that it shouldn't just be this march and go home. Those type of marches, they can be useful in terms of like you are able to mobilize people, show a certain amount of strength, make people feel like they're part of something bigger, help give them the kind of like energy and incitement to go back home to their own communities, to do political work. So they can serve an important purpose. And, we still also, there was the March for Our Lives, the March for Science, but they don't have that type of impact that these continual protests do. That, again, we first saw with Occupy Wall Street, then we saw with Ferguson, where that was, the term I like to use is uprising, right? It's not quite a riot, but rebellion to me seems to be too intentional. That, and because you get a lot of different actors in there, and you also get people who are in there for a lot of very contradictory reasons. Like you go out to these type of uprisings, and they're thrilling. Let's not deny that they're dangerous, but that's part of the thrill. People, you feel alive out there. The amount of state violence that I saw in Portland was just stunning. I was out there some of the worst nights of the violence by federal police, and I have covered hundreds and hundreds of protests, and I have just never seen anything like that in my life. It's just like, I don't want to call it a war zone because, I think that debases what a real war is in terms of the destruction, the deaths, but that's the only way I could describe what it was like to be out there, where you have 1,000 anti-fascists facing off hundreds of cops who are just firing all these sorts of weapons. They're rubber bullets and pepper balls and flashbangs and just tons and tons of tear gas. And they're using them as weapons too, right? They're firing these canisters directly at people. And, you just get these streets, and people are like hunkered down behind shields, and you just hear all these sounds of war, and people are choking and getting hit and bleeding. There are all these medics running through the crowd. I mean, it's just, I wrote a piece for Jadalia describing what it was like that folks can look up. But it's this continual protest that is putting pressure on the state. And so, it's basically, again, it's like a war in terms of it's being a war of attrition. And, we see the state mobilizing more resources, like folks have probably heard about, like, oh, Trump sent in the federal goons. Well, now the state of Oregon and the city are doing that. They're using this legal maneuver where the federal government has deputized state police. So anyone they arrest will be subject to federal offenses. And federal law is it's much harsher than local law because you have, this fascistic government. You have.
Is that a recent development because of what the district attorney did with dropping the charges for so many people charged of local?
It looks to be so. And this is also, this is why I don't want to say police reform doesn't work, but it is evidence as to why it's so difficult. So the background to this is there's a new district attorney in Multnomah County, which is the county where Portland resides. And he said that he was not going to prosecute low-level charges. And this is not stuff like, arson or assault, even though a lot of the assault cases are completely fabricated. The police will tackle someone and then they'll claim they were assaulted because they're punching the person, and the person might involuntarily jerk as you're being punched in the head.
Yeah.
They'll claim it's just like they assaulted me. It's or nothing at all. They'll claim assault when nothing at all happened.
Whenever they claim that their head, that their fist was assaulted by somebody's head, you have to wonder, and that's a fairly common scenario.
Right. So we have this scenario where the district attorney says he's not going to prosecute low level charges, like disorderly conduct, disobeying a lawful order, even riot, because the police basically, they have this blanket authority to declare a riot. And numerous reporters, there've been times where there's like a dozen reporters who are out there, and it's just like the police declared a riot and no one is doing anything.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this kind of like a catch-22, or this Orwellian situation where, well, peace is a riot, and so therefore you're all rioters. And once they declare a riot, they have, under Oregon state law, qualified immunity, so they can do anything they want with no repercussions. So it basically gives the police the legal authority to brutalize people. And so, but this still hasn't worked. Saturday, what's the date? September 6th, I believe, is going to be the 100th day of continual protests. And this is just extraordinary. And, so, on the one hand, I think we should, it's fair that people are outraged by state violence. But at the same time, it's also in its own way a success. The state wouldn't be being so violent, so repressive, unless these movements were not a threat to state power, to police power.
And then all this violence just inspires a lot of people to get even more upset about it. And I mean, I've seen this pattern has played out in many different scenarios in the world in the past, where there have been protests around some particular issue. And then, like, say, for example, in Genoa in Italy during the global justice movement, and then the police riot and attack people with such brutality that then the protests against police violence are several times bigger than the protests that the police were originally attacking, which is kind of, we've seen that pattern here.
His name, Carlo Giuliani, who
the
police killed in Genoa in 2001.
Right.
Yeah.
And then and one thing that's kind of interesting is we remember that name because people getting killed at protests used to be, at least at a lot of these protests in the global justice movement in places like Europe and North America, was fairly very unusual. And now, how many people have been killed at protests over the past few months?
I mean, that's the thing. You say we remember. I try and commit these names to memory, and I can't remember.
Well, now there's too many. It's like trying to remember. I mean, it's like, when we talk about saying their names, I mean, gosh, nobody can possibly remember all the names of all the Black people that have been killed by the police just in the past few months. I mean, in this country, we haven't even heard of most of them.
Let's even talk about protests. There's, and I feel bad that I can't remember their names, but there was this young African-American man who was shot and killed by a Trump supporter in Omaha, Nebraska. This is a few days after George Floyd's death. There was an African-American man in Louisville, Kentucky, who was killed by a National Guard. He was an owner of a barbecue. He wasn't doing anything. They were just shooting wildly. Of course, we now have, this, there was the Patriot Prayer, the member of what a lot of scholars say is a fascist group, Aaron Danielson, who was killed. And then the guy, Michael Rienhol, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name.
Right.
Who said he killed him in self-defense. He was just killed. There was Summer Taylor. They were killed in Seattle by a driver. And I know there was the young man in Austin, Texas, who went to BLM march with his wife. They were an interracial couple. He's white, she's Black, and just really tragic case. She's like a quadruple amputee, and he was killed. He was her caretaker, and I know there are quite a few others who have been killed that I don't even remember, or I haven't even investigated the stories. And Yeah, this is in addition just to all the other people who've been killed since George Floyd, or Breonna Taylor, who was killed shortly before George Floyd was killed, and as sparked its own huge wave of protests.
And then, of course, to say nothing of the people who've been maimed. I mean, just if you follow a lot of a lot of local protesters on Twitter around here in Portland, it's a constant stream of people talking about how bad their injuries are and how they can't leave the house because they're so disoriented, and how many people have like what sounds like really serious concussions or possibly permanent brain damage. So many people have been hit in the head by tear gas canisters. It's amazing that actually fewer people haven't been killed.
You now, if you want to go out and protest, you need a respirator, you need a good helmet, preferably a ballistic helmet, which means military style helmet that costs hundreds of dollars. People are crowdfunding for bulletproof vests. I mean, this is insane. This is to protest. And this report just came out that 93% of BLM protests were peaceful, and even the other 7%. If you look at them, the vast majority of those, probably 90% of them, would be property damage. And let's
Yeah.
be clear, property damage is not violence. Violence happens against another human being. Like smashing a window is not violent. In the past, I felt like there's a lot of adventurism that goes on with that. But now, it's also like, look, the only reason that so many Americans, particularly white Americans, finally said, like, oh shit, maybe we need to do something about this police brutality, was because Minneapolis was burning in the wake of the George Floyd death.
Yeah,
And
I
what
think that had such a huge impact. But I wonder, when you mentioned the adventurism thing, I had to ask, because it's been something that I've thought a lot about. That, like, prior to these uprisings, prior to Occupy Wall Street, prior to especially like the uprisings in 2014, and particularly the past 100 days, like when we had protests against the WTO or the IMF or the G20 or this kind of thing, then it was, I mean, it was, of course, lots of local people, but also loads of people coming from outside. So it was very easy to paint the property destruction that sometimes, oftentimes, to some extent, was involved with these kinds of protests at the big meetings of the elite. In addition to sort of, what they would call nonviolent civil disobedience, there's always some degree of property destruction, but that was easier to paint as outside agitators because, to a large extent, it was. But now it's a different situation where they still try to call it outside agitators. But I feel like most people in the country, I don't know about most, but a lot of people in the country certainly seem to really feel like there's a significant difference here. And now we're talking about just, these are people from every town who are so upset. I don't know if you would say there's this kind of distinction that it takes a different, it gets interpreted differently, and it has a different kind of character.
So the type of property destruction that we've been seeing it's mainly been happening in big cities that are majority minority. And the context for George Floyd, obviously it starts with the Black Lives Matter movement that explodes after Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri, in, what was it, August 2014. And that also came after the murder of Trayvon Martin by a racist vigilante, George Zimmerman. He's Hispanic, but so what? There's a part of the phenomena of an interesting twist, and I wrote a piece about this in the Daily Beast, is a multiracial white supremacy. And so you see groups like Patriot Prayer, whose leader is half Japanese, and his violent enforcer is Samoan, Tusitala Tiny Toes, or the head of the president of the Proud Boys, which one of the leading journalists who writes for a national daily, and he's very measured. He's like, they're fascist, and he's a scholar, so he knows what he's talking about. It's a Afro-Cuban man, Enrique Torrio. So we kind of see, and what the putting these faces of color up there as they did during the RNC, right? You had
Yeah.
like this parade of black faces attesting that Donald Trump isn't racist. And this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning, kind of like they're using identity politics against itself, right? The notion that there's a one-to-one relationship between your race and your politics. And it's just like, oh, if these black people are saying Trump isn't racist, so that they would know, and this is, I think, a problem that begins on the left. This type of racial essentialism
Yeah.
that is used to, because it's stripped of class. But in any case, the type of violence that we're seeing from the right is definitely. We haven't seen this, I think, since the civil rights era. In terms of the Klan and even neo Nazis. But at the same time, one thing that I think the media does a very poor job at historically contextualizing what's going.
Yeah.
And every time in U.S. history there is black social and political upsurge, we see a violent white backlash, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's not a surprise that, with Obama president and then after Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, that we see this violent backlash. But the thing is, when black people protest peacefully, right? Ferguson is its own thing. I think a lot of white people are beginning to understand. It's just like, look, when you see something like Ferguson happen, when you see something like Minneapolis, Baltimore, it's just like people are pissed off. I think a lot of people don't understand and they have a racist reaction. It's just like, why are they burning down their own neighborhood? It's because white people are not listening, including white liberals and white progressives. Black Lives Matter as a movement was clearly and still is a peaceful movement. Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, right? You can't get any more peaceful
Yeah.
protest. He isn't even saying anything. All he's doing is taking a knee during the anthem and then saying, I am protesting, the systemic police brutality and racism in the society. And you get just such this vicious counter response. And polling showed 63% of white Americans opposed him taking a knee. Only 30% supported him. And this lines up with a huge amount of historical polling data. White people don't like it when black people protest. Right.
And that percentage that you just mentioned also lines up with a poll I just recently heard about how many white people support Black Lives Matter as opposed to the overall population. And it was something like 30% of white people.
Really? That's it? Because things have kind of changed. Now, maybe it's kind of, I know that in the wake of the George Floyd killing, that there was, there's a lot of reporting about how there's been this incredible sea change among white Americans, and certainly some of the support has dropped off because it's just like,
I think there might be another sea change happening in the other direction. I mean, certainly not for that 30% that supports Black Lives Matter, but for that other middle 30% that maybe was kind of swinging in the direction of supporting it before. I'm not sure, but what I was reading, but it was basically talking about how all the painting of the protests as violent and talking about how Portland is on fire all the time has had its worn down, had an impact on a certain percentage, a significant percentage of white people in the country. But I don't know.
Well,
how reliable that is. You're looking it up.
I'm doing a live fact check here.
Excellent.
I mean, it says that support has dipped. It's dropped 9 percentage points. And of course this is, and there's a bigger drop even among Republicans, but there was another poll from July 21st. So this is before, right? Trump really starts going, just ramps up the racism. 63% support Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So, but that's we'd have to
63% of white people.
Well, overall,
Oh,
but
okay.
still,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and white adults 52%.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, but you go. Well, okay, this isn't. No, that's actually has to do with racial discrimination. I'd have to look at the actual polling data, but in any case, I think there is or has been significant white support. I maybe it's dropped down to 30%, but that's a side point. In any case, it's that the reason we see this type of unrest is because people are fucking pissed off and that nothing is being done. And it's also a mistake to be like, oh, this has always existed, why now? And sure, certainly, like, you have all these kind of countervailing forces, right? If we look at life expectancy, African American life expectancy has never been higher. Now it still lags white life expectancies significantly. For men, it's like Black men, I think, are like 4 or 5 years behind white men, and Black women are like about 3 or 4 years behind white women. And there's also the phenomena of what's known as missing Black men, that when you start to do essentially use statistics, like using the same type of statistics epidemiologists use, there's about an excess mortality of 400,000 to 500,000 Black men in kind of this large middle range from like 15 to 55. And so when this is why, like I explained, like, look, this is why the police killings are such an important issue. First of all, police are killing something like, I think about, since this data started being tracked in the wake of Ferguson, it's something like maybe about like 500, 600 African Americans a year. So after 10 years, after 20 years, you're talking about 5 to 10,000 deaths. And we know we're not capturing that because this is based on what is being reported. It also doesn't capture a lot of the huge amount of deaths within criminal justice system due to state violence. And this is just a tip of the iceberg in terms of lives that are destroyed, so, and when you start to then go through the social conditions for African Americans, the COVID-19 has exposed this, right? COVID-19 does not affect us all equally. The idea that like, oh, it's just a disease, that everyone's affected. No, it's not. It intersects, with social phenomena, like, the way that you have climatic events, but natural disasters is a contradiction. Natural disasters are human caused, right? Whether or not that hurricane, that excess rainfall, those tornadoes result in death or devastation, you have to look at the social factors. So with COVID-19, when you have African Americans are dying at more than 2 times the rate of white Americans, and now we also see this with Native Americans, and we also see this high excess death rates. And if you know statistics, you know that 2 is an extreme outlier. Even if it was 10% higher, that would be extremely significant. But for it to be 100% higher, the only way you can explain that is through systemic racism. And so this is part of the reason I think, there was this kind of wake up call among white Americans, because people were becoming increasingly aware. There was all this reporting about how COVID-19 was disproportionately killing African Americans, and Trump was completely indifferent, almost sadistic in his glee. It's just like, we need to open up. And there was a very good piece in the Atlantic about this, about the racial contract, by Adam Sewer, talking about how the moment it became clear that it was African Americans who were dying in excess, came to demands from the right and supported by Trump to open the economy back up. So, it's the pandemic of racism intersects with the viral pandemic to create this type of a sea change in attitude. And now, yes, we're seeing, like, I think a lot of people who are starting to be like, oh, I supported Black Lives Matter, but this is too disruptive, this is too destructive, which is absurd, right? All this stuff about, like, Portland is burning, its downtown is destroyed. I've been stuck here for a little while, and I'm like, give me a break. It's just like, there's a couple of blocks right around the federal building where there's some graffiti on stuff. Downtown is operating fine. We have a special guest.
My co-host.
She's looking at me suspiciously. Your 4-year-old or 1-year-old co-host?
That's my 1-year-old. Okay. She just crashed the party. Yeah.
So, downtown is not destroyed, but the right is creating this narrative, right? Because they want to engage in this, like, kind of, there's this ethnic cleansing and this ideological cleansing. Like, again, it's just like, I really get pissed off at these goddamn academics who are like, oh, this isn't really fascism. It's just like, we have the banning of an entire religious group for all intents and purposes, the Muslim ban. We have this banning on immigrants. Trump has shut down the border. His whole campaign was this just howl of racism from the moment he stepped down that gold escalator and said Mexicans are rapists, drug dealers, and criminals, or murderers. It's just like, it has been this primal howl of white nationalism.
One of the elements that seems like sort of notably lacking, that kind of, like, I guess is what kind of makes people make the banana republic comparison, is, which, not to say that you can't be a fascist and be a dictator of Central American country at the same time. You obviously can, but the question of, like, the question of fascists doing something useful for the working class in order to get the allegiance of the working class, or at least some elements of the working class, which it just doesn't. That element of Trump's efforts at fashion, like the infrastructure project that he campaigned on, you'd think that he would want to also do that to, like, get a little bit more allegiance going on there.
Well, no, so they have used, even before the pandemic, it was this massive, the Keynesianism that he was engaged in. So, the demand side priming of the economy was huge. They were doing these massive increases to the military budget. They were just, spending huge amounts of money on agriculture, just, tens and tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to make up for all the damage he's caused with his trade war. Right. When you're spending money on the military, you're spending money on the U.S. economy, right? More. It's just like, however many's, and I don't know what the numbers of military now, but it's been around 2 million, I think. Right. So if you're giving everyone a significant pay increase, that's money that is going into the economy, because most U.S. troops are still based stateside. If you're spending more on materials, well, most of that is going into the U.S. economy. Then to get these deals through, the Democrats, sure, they were, like, doing good parliamentary maneuvers, and they were getting Trump to agree to, like, all this social service spending. right? So, and they were running up these massive annual deficits, and so it wasn't like this, hey, we're going to have this $1 trillion infrastructure bill, but they were pumping a huge amount of money into the economy. And remember, up until the pandemic hit, the economy was going like gangbusters. Now it's just the stock market that's going like gangbusters.
Yeah, the stock market's doing very well, but most other people
How's your portfolio?
Yeah, right. My portfolio. In closing, Arun, do you have any predictions for the next few months or weeks in this city or this country? I know it's a terrible question to ask, but I have to.
Chaos inside a shit show wrapped in a hellscape.
That sounds about right. Thank you so much.
I mean, it's going to be fucking crazy. But the thing is, we need to do everything possible to get Trump out of office. The amount of death and devastation, but of course that is not enough, right? There is no going back to normal like a lot of liberals want to do, but we need to get Trump out of office.
Yeah, and then once he's out of office, it'll be interesting what happens with him in opposition.
Well, if he gets out of office, I think I will say we will see. One of the things that's social phenomena, like kind of really that's been missing during the Trump years: mass shooters. Kind of the random mass shooters. The mass shooters that have existed are politicized mass shooters. So Patrick Crusius and the Walmart shooting, Robert Bowers and the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting. They're all these politicized mass shootings. I think we'll see kind of a lot more random white male mass shootings. But I think if Trump is forced out of office, then we're going to see more organized terrorism on the scale of Oklahoma City.
Yep. Sounds about right, too.
Okay.
Yeah. You thinking about which country you might move to? If you can.
I like France, but they got their problems.
Yeah. Thanks so much for being on the show, Arun. It's been very informative, and actually I could talk to you for another hour or so, but you probably have some other things to do.
Yeah. Okay. I have a little work to do, but great talking to you, David.
Great talking to you. Thank you. Take care.
You too.
See you soon. And thanks, everybody, for tuning into this conversation with Arun Gupta. You can find all of these discussions archived in various places, including on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics in the Discussions with David playlist. You'll also find them all in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts, at davidrovics.com or on the David Rovics mobile app. If you want to support my broadcasting efforts, you're most welcome to become a patron at patreon.com/David Rovics, where all these broadcasts are also available for anyone to download, along with some patron-only offerings as well. If you'd like to support the album project that I'll be live streaming from the studio starting on the last Saturday of this month and make it something more than a solo acoustic recording, go to davidrovics.com/pandemic sessions. And finally, if you're in the Portland area, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up to receive text notifications so you can be part of Portland emergency eviction response when the investment banks that own half of this city start trying to evict so many of our neighbors. Remember, don't pay the rent. Don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.